They watched you fall, quietly, patiently, and when the silence wrapped around your pain like a cold blanket, they disappeared, not out of guilt, not out of kindness, but because they knew healing takes time. And they wanted you strong enough to be broken again. It wasn't absence, it was calculation. They needed you to stitch your wounds, rebuild your light, restore the fire in your eyes, so they could return when you least expected it, cloaked in smiles and rewrites of the past. But what they didn't anticipate was this: you didn't just heal, you transformed, and in your transformation they lost the script. They came back for the same version of you they once broke, but that version no longer lives here. Now they face something far more terrifying than silence, a soul that outgrew their shadow. The illusion of absence they never really left, not in the way you hoped. What you mistook for absence was a silent theater, carefully staged to watch your breakdown or your comeback from behind the curtains. Don't romanticize their distance. It wasn't grace, it was surveillance. They disappeared not because they respected your pain, but because they were fascinated by it. They wanted to see how deep you would sink, how much you would ache, and if you could rise without them. And if you did rise, oh, that's when they'd return, not with apology, not with truth, but with a mask polished by time. You see, for people like them, silence is not regret, it's a tactic. They needed your heart quiet, your thoughts scattered, your world collapsed, just long enough to make you believe it was over. They hoped that distance would make you doubt the damage. That time would blur the betrayal. That healing would turn into loneliness, and in that loneliness, you'd crave what once broke you. But what they didn't realize is that your solitude taught you something they feared: self-trust. That while you cried behind closed doors, something stronger than the pain was growing: clarity. Clarity about who they were, and more importantly, who you became in their absence. When they left, you were shattered, but over time, you stopped asking why. You stopped chasing closure. You stopped needing answers. And in that stillness, you learned to breathe again, laugh again, believe again. That's what they hate the most, not that you healed, but that you healed without their permission. They return now with familiar words, with vague concern, with half-hearted attempts to slide back into your life, as if they were never part of what you had to recover from. But you see it now, don't you? The timing, the convenience, the eerie way they show up right when you've rebuilt. It's not coincidence, it's control. They come not to reconnect, but to reinsert themselves into your story, to reclaim the power your silence stole from them. But this time, you don't need to explain the chapters they missed. You don't need to hand them your piece as proof that you've moved on. They made their choice when they vanished, and you made yours when you survived. Now they return, not to finish what they started, but to undo what you've become. But it's too late. The person they left behind is gone, and the one standing here today, they don't recognize that version. Because that version has learned that absence isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's a gift in disguise, one that reveals not who they were, but who you were always meant to be without them. The anatomy of control. They never wanted connection, they wanted compliance. From the beginning, their love was conditional, their care was calculated. Every compliment had a hook, every hug had a cost, and when they left, it wasn't because they let go. It was because they thought they could return later and find you exactly where they left you, confused, vulnerable, eager to please. You see, control doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like affection, disguised as concern. Sometimes it wears the mask of patience. They let you breathe, but not to set you free, only to watch how long you'd survive before crawling back. It was never about reconciliation. It was about resetting the balance of power. And when you didn't fall apart the way they predicted, that's when the plan shifted. They came back not with love, but with leashes. They spoke of second chances, of unfinished stories, of how much they've changed. But listen closely, those aren't apologies. Those are strategies, because someone who once manipulated your silence will never honor your voice. They don't return because they miss the bond. They return because your strength is a threat to their memory of dominance. Your healing disrupts their narrative. They had painted you as weak, dependent, emotional. But when you refuse to be small, when you learn to set boundaries, to say no without explanation, to smile without their approval, that's when they felt their power slipping. And they couldn't handle it, so they returned, trying to rebuild their old position in your life using new words, polished gestures, softer tones. But look deeper. Nothing has changed except the method. The goal is the same: to rule, not to relate. They want access, not accountability. Influence, not intimacy. You rising makes them restless. Your peace makes them impatient, because they thought you were just a temporary version of yourself during the healing. They didn't expect you to stay strong, but here's the truth. You've outgrown the cycle. You've decoded the pattern, and now you see it clearly. Control is not always about shouting or force. Sometimes it's about calculated kindness and perfectly timed returns. But this time, you don't owe softness to someone who only comes back to rearrange your stability. You don't have to explain why your boundaries feel like rejection to someone who never respected them in the first place. You've learned that real love doesn't punish you for growing. It doesn't return only when you're whole again, just to undo you. No, it stays, it supports, it honors. So let them call you cold, distant, unrecognizable, because that's exactly what freedom looks like to someone who only understood closeness through control. And now you're free. The mirror they can't escape, your healing, didn't just change you, it exposed them. You became a mirror they never wanted to face, because every ounce of strength you gained, every layer of clarity you uncovered, forced them to look at the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime avoiding. You weren't just someone they hurt. You became proof that they were never as kind, as strong, or as good as they pretended to be. And that truth terrifies them. That's why they come back, not out of affection, but desperation. They need to rewrite the story, to repaint their reflection, to soften the sharp edges of their past with your forgiveness. But what they forget is that healing makes you see differently. Where once you saw love, now you see control. Where once you saw sacrifice, now you see silence. Where once you saw connection, now you recognize dependency disguised as care. They cannot stand that, because if you no longer see them as the center of your story, what power do they have left? They thought you would break and stay broken, but you didn't. You rebuilt, and now your very presence unsettles them. You walk lighter, you speak slower. Your peace is unsettling because it was born from chaos they created. And nothing disturbs a person more than being reminded that they were the storm someone learned to dance in. So they return, haunted by your strength, drawn to the very light they tried to extinguish. They try to be nicer, more understanding. They use words like closure, as if healing is something they can now be part of. But what they're really saying is, let me back in so I can believe I'm still the hero of your story. But they are not anymore. You've seen what they refused to admit, that their charm was conditional, their loyalty was fragile, and their kindness always had strings. You didn't just grow, you outgrew them. And they feel it in every unreturned message, in every boundary you now hold firm, in every moment you choose silence over explanation. They feel the distance and it burns, because for people like them, it's not about missing you, it's about missing control over how you see them. They can't manipulate the mirror anymore. You shattered that illusion, and in doing so, you took back the narrative. They hate that, but deep down they know it's deserved, and no matter how many times they return with softened voices and sentimental rewrites, they cannot undo what you've seen. They cannot unbreak the mirror, and now, every time they look at you, they see what they lost, not just a person, but the reflection they could no longer manipulate, and that truth is louder than any apology they'll ever offer. The false redemption they return with soft eyes and crafted words, hoping you'll forget the storm they once were. They speak in apologies they never gave when it mattered. They act as if time alone has earned them forgiveness, as if silence was penance. But make no mistake, this is not redemption, it's performance. They don't come back because they've changed. They come back because you have, because now you carry something they never expected: wisdom. Distance gave you vision, pain gave you clarity, and now they approach not as a redeemer, but as a revisionist, trying to edit a past you lived through and they ignored. They'll say things like, "I didn't know," "I was broken too," or "we both made mistakes." But listen closely, these aren't confessions. These are negotiations. They want access, not responsibility. Re-entry, not reconciliation. They speak of closure, but closure is not what they seek. What they want is reassurance that they were not the villain in your story, and if they can't erase what they did, they'll try to dilute it. So they paint over the pain, soften the timeline, twist the memory until even you question your own scars. That is not love. That is manipulation in a new disguise, because real redemption doesn't seek comfort, it accepts discomfort. It does not ask to be let back in. It asks simply to be held accountable. But they won't do that. Why? Because accountability requires them to sit with the very things they ran from. So instead, they cloak their return in poetic words, nostalgia, and rewrites of the past. They say, "Let's start over." But the version of you that once allowed them in that version no longer lives here. You learned the cost of giving someone another chance just because they finally noticed the damage they did. You learned that forgiveness does not mean re-entry. And healing does not mean repeating the cycle in softer tones. You don't owe anyone a part in your present just because they regret how they left your past. You owe yourself peace. You owe yourself honesty. And if their return requires you to forget the very pain that shaped your growth, then it is not redemption, it's intrusion. They don't want to heal what they broke. They want to convince you it was never that broken. But this time, you're not falling for gentle lies. This time, your silence isn't uncertainty, it's strength. This time, you're not interested in proving your worth to someone who only values what they lose. Because your healing is not an invitation, it is a boundary, and no matter how sincere they sound, no matter how much time has passed, you will know the truth. Real redemption doesn't knock just when you've rebuilt. It shows up when you're still bleeding, and they didn't. Your rise is their reckoning. They thought your silence meant surrender. They mistook your stillness for weakness. They walked away assuming you would crumble, assuming the echo of their absence would break you from the inside out. But what they never predicted was your rise, and now they can't unsee it. The version of you that greets them today is unfamiliar, stronger, calmer, no longer moved by guilt or longing, and it terrifies them. Because for people who feed on power, nothing is more threatening than the one who no longer needs them. They thought you'd wait, thought you'd need closure, explanation, one more conversation to make peace with the past. But instead, you chose to evolve. You chose to grow in silence, to heal without performance, to become something they can no longer manipulate. Your rise wasn't loud, it was quiet, deliberate, built in the shadows where they left you. And that's what makes it powerful. You didn't rise to prove them wrong. You rose to prove to yourself that you were always more than what they reduced you to. And now, your peace is their punishment. Because they know deep down, they no longer have a seat at the table they once flipped. They see your glow and realize they are no longer the source. They watch you speak without seeking validation, love without fear, walk without looking back. And it undoes them, not because they miss you, but because they lost control over the version of you they once shaped. They didn't just lose access, they lost influence, and that's a grief their ego never prepared for. They return, haunted by the reality that you were not dependent. You were just kind, you weren't fragile, you were loyal. You didn't stay because you were weak, you stayed because your heart was true. And now they see it, They broke something they can never build again. Your rise is their reckoning, because now they are forced to confront a truth that rewrites their entire narrative. They didn't destroy you. They built you by accident. They were the storm that taught you how to stand, the silence that taught you how to listen, the absence that taught you how to rely on your own light. And now, that light burns so brightly, they can't even look at you without flinching. They come back expecting to find the same broken soul, but instead, they find a fortress. And no matter what they say, no matter how many doors they knock on with regret, they now understand something they never saw coming. You don't need to slam the door shut. You just have to leave it closed. Because their chapter ended the moment you realized you were the story all along.